question. How do you know if Jesus is truly leading your church? Well, let's suppose for a moment that you would say, well, of course he's leading the church. Jesus is the head of the church. I often ask people, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you that Jesus feels the same way, that he really is leading in a real-time way in your context? What would it look like if Jesus had a functional seat at your leadership table? If more than just the figurehead of the church, if he really was the functional head of your church? This is the question I found myself completely captivated by as I was stepping into the lead role at St. Albert Alliance Church. What does it look like for Jesus to lead his church in real time? What does it mean for Jesus to be the functional head of St. Albert Alliance Church and not merely the figurehead? How would we need to operate in order for Jesus to truly be involved in real-time decisions? What would it look like for him to be free to express his opinions on things big and small in a way that was taken seriously? How does Jesus get a seat at the head of the table, practically speaking? Back in 2011, I had no idea how that actually could or should look, but I found myself determined by the grace of God and no doubt the prompting of the Spirit to press into this as best I could, with the prayer that one day it would genuinely feel like, to all those who are regularly and meaningfully engaged in our church, that Jesus really is the head and that he really is leading this thing. So I wasn't sure where to start, but I knew that there had been this book that had helped unlock some new ways of looking at things for me. And so the first thing I did as the newly installed lead pastor was to ask our pastoral team and elders to read this book over the course of the summer. It's a book by John Eldredge called Walking with God. And I didn't feel equipped to kind of teach the staff and elders myself at that point, but thought we could engage this wrestle together. So end of the summer comes, and as a pastoral team, we had an all-day pastoral team retreat. And I remember clear as day beginning the meeting by saying, I do want to spend some time debriefing the book and get a sense of what was encouraging, challenging, confusing to you. But more than talk about it, I want us to practice the kinds of things he talks about. I want us to practice that as a team. I want us to begin to stop and to ask Jesus to see where he might have an opinion on something, and then actually wait to hear what he may have to say about it. So that's fine. Leaders sometimes make pronouncements like that, and the team doesn't necessarily know what it is you're talking about, and sometimes as the leader, I'm not really sure what I'm talking about either. But there it was. And so the very first thing we talk about as we come to this all-day staff retreat is we're going to go around the table with each staff member sharing where they were at in their fall preparations. And when we came to the person who was pastoring our small groups at the time, she shared that we did not have the kind of participation from leaders and participants as we were coming into September that we were expecting. We'd been really excited about the series we were doing. We thought there's going to be lots of people engaged in this, and that hadn't been the case to that point. And so I just start to ask the question of the room. So, why do you think that is? What could we do to help bolster greater participation in small groups? And one of the team members sitting at the back of the room sort of raised his hand and said, "Didn't you just tell us that we were going to ask Jesus about these things?" I was like, "I certainly did. Thanks for paying attention. Just testing to see if everyone was listening to what I was saying here in the room." And so for the first time as a team, we stopped the meeting to ask Jesus if he had an opinion or any insight into his church and into this particular leadership issue we were managing. So I've never done this before, but I asked Jesus a really simple question, something like, so Jesus, we don't have to guess as to why we've had minimal initial participation in small groups as we come to the fall, because you already know. This is your church, and you are the head. And so if you have any insight you'd like to share, we'd really be interested to hear it. Jesus, from your perspective, why have we had a lackluster start to our small groups this fall? And then instead of pooling our collective ignorance as to why that might be, doing our best brainstorming work, which normally would be what we would have done prior to this point, we were quiet for just a few minutes. And while we're quiet, I'm praying like crazy that this is going to work. Like, Jesus, you better come through here. And then I said something to the room that I've said countless times since then. And I said, so what do you think Jesus might be saying? Now, it always takes real-time courage to be the first one to speak. And at this point, no one on our team was feeling overly confident that what was coming to their heart and mind was actually Jesus. But I sort of started on one side of the room and said, you know what, I want to hear from everybody. What do you think he might be saying? And so we started on my left, and going around the table, there were 10 of us in the room, 10 pastors in the room that day. And each person shared, albeit with some trepidation, about what they thought Jesus might have been saying. And a number of things surfaced as we went around the table, that first go around, that seemed to be along similar themes. And so much so that it was kind of striking as people are looking around the room saying, did that just work? And so I thought, we should ask Jesus a follow-up question. And so we're going to pause again. And I say, okay, Jesus, it seems to us like maybe you are saying, these 2 or 3 things are factors. If we're hearing you right, do you have an opinion as to what you'd like us to do about them? Like, how do we address these things? I sat quietly again. I said again after a few minutes, what do you think Jesus might be saying? And we shared around the table. I started on this side. I'm going to go around the whole table. And it was fascinating because, again, there's probably 2 or 3 things that came to the forefront. And we implemented those things. And we ended up having the best season of small group engagement that we had ever had as a church. And do you know what we found out that day? Jesus knows stuff. And it was the start of our journey. We ended up stopping to ask Jesus questions about the ministry and various things 5 or 6 times that day. And it was the start of a new pattern for us, a new modus operandi of how we were going to function and practice and invite Jesus to serve as the functional head of the church. And we've been following that basic pattern increasingly in every facet of the church since that time. So I did something very similar with our elders. That first meeting after the summer, reading that book, I said, I do want to debrief the book, but more than that, I want us to practice listening for his voice. And so since then, we have learned a lot from experience and from trial and error, how to further cultivate our capacity to really tune in, to recognize the voice of Jesus as he speaks and as he gives leadership in our church. And so over the course of the next few years, we started to live into what we later defined as 10 foundational convictions for us as a whole church, as it relates to learning to listen for Jesus' voice, that he might have increasing functional leadership in our church community. So I'm going to encourage you, before we continue, just to pause and consider the question there with your team, or those who are gathered with you. How do we know if Jesus is really leading our church? What would it look like if Jesus really had a functional seat at our leadership table? Our journey of leadership in this particular church spanned more than a decade, and over time we began to identify some foundational convictions that guided our practice in response to the question, what might it look like if Jesus was really leading our church? What would have to be true of us if Jesus was going to get a functional seat at the leadership table? And while there is certainly nothing unique about these convictions in and of themselves, we have found that as they are taken together and actually practiced and lived into, not just talked about, collectively they really help to reshape our culture as a leadership and ultimately as a church. So the first foundational conviction is simply that hearing God is all about relationship. Cannot state this strongly enough. Many times listening in prayer, hearing God's voice can become somewhat utilitarian. It can get diminished to simply being about knowing what do I need to do to make my life work out in the way that I want it to. God, not really sure what to do here. If you could give me a little help, give me a little insight so that I'm blessed in what I'm doing, that'd be great. Oh, and just to make you aware, I'm on kind of a tight timeline, bit of a rush here, so let's have it. I'm listening. This approach, though I will say it is among the more common things I've heard from people when they talk about struggling to hear God's voice, is to completely misunderstand God and his heart for us. Taking a posture of listening for God's voice out of the context of the ongoing cultivation of intimacy in relationship with him severely undermines our ability to really tune into, recognize his voice, to hear and discern what he's saying when he does speak. And I trust that some of the reasons for this will become clear as you work through the various sessions in this series. But for now, just really want to reiterate that God's heart is for relationship with us. And we should only expect to grow in our ability to tune in to his voice and to recognize his voice amongst all others as we cultivate a daily personal walk with him. Second foundational conviction is that steeping in Scripture is crucial. Though the Bible is not the only way in which God speaks to us, it is certainly the primary means through which we will hear him and recognize that it's him. One of the sessions that my wife and I will do when we're teaching on hearing God is, what does the inaudible voice of God sound like? And you can actually find that in another part in this series. And the question is, how do we know it's his voice that we're hearing? And there are a number of things that we talk about in that session, but right at the heart of the matter is the priority of steeping, the essential practice of a patient and reflective and prayerful engagement with God's written word, humbly asking him to illuminate our hearts and minds to his will and his heart for us. In fact, we'd often teach people in our church that it actually can be a dangerous thing to try and listen for God's voice without immersing ourselves in the Scriptures. And this is where people tend to get off track and may end up misrepresenting what God may actually be saying if they're not living out of the reality of the Bible. The Scriptures reliably set the boundaries of what God has said and ever will say. And we ought to have a rock-solid confidence and conviction that God will never speak to us in prayer in a way that contradicts or undermines his written word to us in any way. Our third conviction is that hurry diminishes capacity. There's simply no way to rush this maturing process. Relationships can't be rushed. If we're only ever trying to listen for God's voice while we're on the run, instead of cultivating a regular habit of meaningful alone time with him, it's going to be tough to make real progress in our capacity and confidence to recognize his voice. If we treat hearing God's voice like a Google search, where I type in my question and expect to get an extensive list of possible answers a moment later, I suspect you know this, we're going to be disappointed. We sometimes have said to those in our context, if you want to use Google to help you, try doing a search on how many times the phrase, "wait on the Lord," shows up in the Bible. If we don't have a regular habit of waiting on the Lord, it will severely diminish our capacity to recognize him when he does speak. And just a little aside here, pro tip, deep breathing to help slow our heart rate down is really useful in preparing us to hear him. I'll often say when I'm leading a group to create some space to hear God's voice, something to the effect of, I'll say, so let's close our eyes and take a few moments to become fully attentive to Jesus. Take some deep breaths. Just become consciously aware that God is with us right here, right now. I'll often say, just imagine yourself coming before Jesus and just waiting quietly before him. If we come genuinely seeking God's input and counsel, we're going to need some intention and practice to slow down, to breathe deeply, to become fully attentive to Jesus. Hurry always diminishes our capacity to hear God. Our fourth foundational conviction is that humility is paramount. We always sought to encourage our people to be very cautious whenever they talk about what they believe God may be saying to them. None of us ever becomes infallible when it comes to recognizing God's voice. And regardless of how confident we may feel that we really have heard from God, we'd always say to our people, we do well to hold it with open hands and heart. And the two phrases I use most often when speaking about hearing God's voice, certainly in the context of a group of people, is the question you've already heard me say, so what do you think Jesus might be saying? Inherent in this question is an invitation to humility. In contrast to, I definitely know exactly what Jesus is saying? That's the first question. What do you think he might be saying? And the second question I'll often ask is something to the effect of, so as you just sit quietly with Jesus, open to his voice, what's coming to your mind right now? What is lingering as you just quiet yourself before him? Speaking about our experiences with God, this kind of language and posture we have found to be really helpful. For the most part, I really have discouraged people from saying, "Thus saith the Lord," or "God told me such and such," because as you perhaps have experienced, it tends to shut down conversations. It's like, well, if God's told you that, does that mean there's nothing else to say or discern? Most times it's not helpful, and to be frank, it's not even how God usually works. And so our conviction has been that a wiser posture is a humble one. I think Jesus might be saying, or, what's lingering in my mind as I sit with the Lord is, we need utmost humility in this journey. And you may be 100% convinced that you've heard God speak something to you. And of course, we're sharing our experience in these various sessions because we know that because of God's grace, we truly can hear him speak to us. And yet there are many nuances to God's voice and in how we interpret what he said. We need humility, and often we need each other to get the full picture of what God may be seeking to communicate with us. So it's one of our foundational convictions. Foundational conviction number 5 for us is commitment to obedience matters. If you come before the Lord, asking him for guidance, asking him for direction on some matter that you have not previously resolved to do whatever it is he may ask of you, we have found you'll find it difficult to develop a confidence that you really are hearing his voice. Why do we think that is? It's because if you're going to be wondering if you're just hearing what you want to hear or if it's really him. If we are undecided on whether we are truly willing to do whatever he may direct us to do, we have to ask ourselves, why would we expect God to speak to us if we're not yielded to him enough to do what he says? If our only intention is to listen for his voice enough to take what we hear under advisement, we'll see what you have to say, Jesus, and we'll give it serious consideration. And we think it's a bit presumptuous to think God is going to be overly talkative. So it's got to be a commitment to do what he says. Number 6 for us is there is no substitute for practice. This goes back to relationship stuff again. You think about the first time you hear someone's voice. How likely is it that you are going to remember what their voice sounds like if you don't talk with them for another month or two? Compare that with listening to that person's voice all day, every day, at home or in school, in the workplace. Whose voice are you going to more quickly recognize? In the context in which we served, we'd facilitate a multi-week Hearing God course in which we'd lead people in listening prayer practicums every week, just sort of in the room with us. And then we'd give people listening prayer homework for a week, essentially a week's worth of listening exercises that they could do on their own before coming back to the next session. And we got material from another church that helped us with this. We've done the same thing when preaching and teaching on a Sunday morning. For example, we did one 8-week sermon series one time on hearing God's voice, and we gave the whole congregation a week's worth of practice for all 8 weeks of the series, just to help them lean into this. And we said to them, you won't learn to recognize God's voice just by listening to us talk about it. You have to spend time on this on your own, listening with others. There is no substitute for practice. Our 7th foundational conviction is to start small. One of the things that hinders many people from growing in confidence that they really are recognizing God's voice is when they only try to listen to him on big things with big implications. If you're only listening for God's direction on things like, should you buy the house? Should you change jobs? Marry a particular person? Or whether or not you should take on more studies? Your emotion, at a minimum, is likely to cloud your ability to hear clearly, to really have confidence that it's his voice you're hearing, especially if you're early on in the journey. And so one of our foundational convictions has been that most of our listening prayer journey should be about things where the stakes are relatively low, where quite honestly, if you didn't hear it quite right, it doesn't have huge ramifications. So it's the difference between asking Jesus, should we move forward with a multi-million-dollar building project? Or asking him, Jesus, as you survey what you're doing amongst our church family and community, what are you excited about? Right? The consequences of hearing accurately or inaccurately are decidedly different in terms of overall stakes. And you consider those two scenarios. It's wise to start small in our listening journey. And this is what all good relationships are built on. Now, my wife Lisa and I have had a few pretty major conversations and decisions through our 25 plus years of marriage, but we have had thousands upon thousands of conversations about small things. Our relationship has been built on the thousands of small conversations, not the few big ticket decision items we've had throughout our life together. And all of that time, growing with one another in the day-to-day conversations of everyday life is what provided the foundation to be able to make those bigger decisions as we've gotten to know each other better and to know what we think and what we value and to know what matters to us. And the same is true with God. We have to create space just to cultivate in the small things life with him. Eighth foundational conviction is that journaling or writing out what we think he's saying brings focus. By far the biggest question people ask when it comes to hearing God's voice is, how do I know if it's God's voice or if it's just my own ideas? And obviously there are a whole series of videos here to help respond to that question. But one of the things that is so helpful is to get out of our own head by writing down what we're thinking and processing. It can be an enormously helpful practice when it comes to recognizing God's voice. Now, of course, there are certainly different ways to do this. The primary means we encourage people towards was to essentially write out, it's like a conversation with God. And so it encouraged them begin by writing, your own initials, writing out the question or thing you're wondering about, and then putting the initial G for God or J for Jesus, and then writing out what comes to mind as you think about how he's responding to your question. Encourage people, write out what comes to mind, without overthinking it at first. And always tell people it's better to start writing what comes to your mind as you quiet your heart, and then go back and read what you've written once you're done, and you just simply ask Jesus, is this you? Am I in step with your Spirit on this? And then as we walk through the conversation that we've written out here, we pay attention to the level of rest or unrest we feel. Some things we've written might really stand out. We think, I really think that's from God. Other things that we've written out, we may think, could be, I'm not sure. And then there may be other things we've written out where we think, I don't have a strong sense one way or the other. All of that is okay. Again, we're seeking to cultivate our relationship with God. And if we keep coming to him in humility, with a commitment to do what he says, he's so gracious to help us understand his heart and direction for us when we need to know what we need to know. So the purpose of writing it out is quite simply, if you question everything that comes to your mind before you write it down, for most people, we have found, especially early on, it just can be challenging to get out of your own head and to really discern with clarity what God may be seeking to share with you. There's just lots of thoughts jumbled in there. Journaling brings focus. Number 9, listening with others accelerates confidence. So someone might think, if we really did hear a word from God, would it not be obvious to us? How could God speak to me and me perhaps not recognize it? But then we have to remember one of Israel's greatest prophets, the prophet Samuel. You likely are familiar with the story. 1 Samuel 3, Samuel is still a boy, and he hears God's, in his case, audible voice 3 times. And yet Samuel didn't recognize it was God's voice until someone else, a man named Eli, was able to help Samuel realize it was God who was speaking to him. This conviction that listening with others accelerates confidence was one of the most important parts of our journey as a church leadership team, both staff and elders. And you'll be hearing a lot more about that through other videos in this series. For now, I'll just say that getting real-time confirmation with others who are also listening on the same issue can really help accelerate our confidence that what was going through our minds, that we wrote down, really was God's voice, because it seems like, oh, you heard that? Oh, that's similar to what I heard. And it brings a confidence. Okay, maybe that was what God's voice sounds like to me. And so we really prioritize listening together in our church context, and in particular with our leadership teams. So then that leads to the 10th foundational conviction that sort of evolved over a period of time. Ask for confirmation. So again, we teach a full session on what this might look like, what kinds of confirmations we might experience, where to be attentive, and so on. So I'm not going to say much about it here, but the basic premise is that the bigger the implications of a decision, the more important it is that we get confirmation from multiple sources. Again, in the earlier example, asking Jesus what he's excited about does not require the same kind of confirmation as discerning what he may be saying about a multi-million-dollar building project. Confirmation is a huge gift God gives us when we genuinely seek him, because he recognizes that we are finite human beings, and we simply don't see everything there is to see. We should not be shy about asking God for confirmation. And so, before we continue, I'm just going to encourage you just to pause and consider this question of those that are gathered there with you. What convictions do we currently hold as a church when it comes to hearing God's voice? And so I might encourage you, even just take time to practice right now, asking Jesus, which two of these foundational convictions we just have heard are already strong in our community? And Jesus, which two of these foundational convictions could use more attention? So I'm going to encourage you, don't rush this. Take at least 5 minutes of silence to consider before sharing with each other. 5 minutes may seem like forever. I encourage you just to use a timer so that you're not thinking, advancing too quickly. Give space to see what Jesus may be saying to you and your team. Habits that we learn sort of on the fly. As in, we didn't start out with them, but over time, these 3 habits got incorporated into our leadership culture and began to show up essentially every week in some way, shape, or form. And in one sense, there really is just one primary habit that's got a couple of nuances to it. And these are not complicated or particularly insightful. I just have found that they're not very common. They're not very normal, even in a lot of our churches, although that has changed a lot, which I'm grateful for. The truth is, like many things in life, simple as these things may be, they don't do us any good unless we implement them as a habit. And so I want to talk about these. The first habit is simply be looking for places to invite his input. As I've talked about with pastors and leaders for more than a decade now about these matters, it seems like on an initial level, the truth is we simply aren't always looking to invite Jesus' specific input into our decision-making all that often. My experience has been that people maybe pray to open a meeting, sometimes they pray to close a meeting, but that's sort of the extent of Jesus' involvement, it sort of seems. But it's a completely different mindset if you start the meeting inviting Jesus to speak, to have the floor, to sit at the head of the table, and then to anticipate that throughout your conversation, there will be times when it will be really helpful to know what Jesus is thinking, to check in with him, to see if he has a perspective on what it is that's being discussed. This is the first habit, and in many respects, as simple as it is, it's the most important one. Do we have an expectation that Jesus will want to have the floor at some point in our discussion? Or do we think he's generally disinterested in what we're talking about? And if so, what does that say about the importance of what we're engaging around if we're talking about his church? We just try to always assume he likely is going to want to have the floor at some point. Let's be looking for where that might be. So that's not to say we would take time for listening prayer in every single one of our meetings, but it is to say it was our habit. It was normally what we would do. The second habit is where you have an opinion, let that be a prompter to invite.
Don't miss on Guguda TV.
There are many times when God leads us in directions that are uncomfortable on some level.